As naval aviators, we pride ourselves on being ready for any possible eventuality. But when it comes to combat, is it possible to be ready for everything? So for the answer to that question, we turn to our good friend, Vice Admiral Ted Slapshot Carter, who commanded at many levels of the Navy and who found himself in harm's way a number of times along the way. So there's a naval aviation adage, Slapshot, which is train like you fight. And so the question going into 1999 is, to what degree do you feel like that the squadron VF-14 was trained for the combat that was upcoming?
As the conflict in Kosovo sprung up, the Air Force was involved starting on March 24th. We left with VF-41, Black Aces, and my squadron, VF-14, which I was in command, with our airplanes, LANTIRN attached to our airplanes. We had trained with them. And then, of course, we had our F-18 sister squadrons, VFA-15 and VFA-87. And we got a change of orders, go top speed from Norfolk to get into the Mediterranean, to get involved in Operation Noble Anvil, as Sixth Fleet called it then, but also from the NATO side, it was called Operation Allied Force. So the interesting part of this is we crossed the Atlantic in 4 days on the Theodore Roosevelt, best speed. So try to imagine that. I know you've made that deployment a number of times. That's the fastest I'd ever gone across.
That's like half of what it would normally take.
Strait of Gibraltar, no flying. So the airplanes that were on the flight deck were stuck after the flying on. And then we got 1 day of flying in the Mediterranean to just kind of check out our systems. We were scheduled to go into our first combat mission on April 6th, 1999.
So how long had you been skipper of the Tophatters? Because you were XO first, and then you fleeted up to be skipper. How long had you been skipper by late March of '99?
Yeah, only about 4 months. And myself and one of my department heads, Scooter Moyer, are the only two that had actually seen any actual combat in the F-14 Tomcat. None of it in the air-to-ground role. Thankfully, because of my predecessors, John Snedeker, who had been the commanding officer, and then Bernie Parent, they did a great job of bringing in some A6 talent into that squadron, so that we did have some air-to-ground mindset, some real talent, and both VF-41 and VF-14 had some A6 talent to make us ready. And as you said, we did a lot of training with LANTIRN, although all of us probably wish we had done more as we were getting ready to go into, no kidding, combat operations.
So you mentioned Scooter Moyer. I was a RAG instructor with Scooter. Fun fact, he was also a Blue Angel a couple of times.
Yeah, Blue Angel before he joined us in VF-14 as a department head, and then immediately a Blue Angel afterwards because of a mishap, and they needed another slot pilot. So yeah, Scooter had a lot of time with the Blue Angels, but I'll tell you what, one of the best fighter pilots I've ever flown with, the smoothest stick and throttle guy I know, and almost all of my high-end combat missions during Allied force in Kosovo and in Iraq, following with the no-fly zone, were flown with Scooter.
The thing that was cool about LANTIRN and some of the other stuff that, as the Tomcat evolved, the backseat got busier and busier, you know, as you and I went along in our careers. So can we describe some of the basic flow between front and back seat and the PTID and other things that we had to do to just drop, let's say, a GBU-12 before we get into the specifics of some of the missions that you did in Kosovo?
Yeah, the back seat really went through a major transformation with this addition of a LANTIRN pod. For a lot of the Tomcat pilots and radar intercept officers, you know, the old tactical information display, this round display that, you know, had this kind of cool green image on there, that was taken out, and then we put in what we affectionately called the big screen. So the programmable tactical information display, or PTID, was put into the back seat. This was a huge display compared to what was in the F-18 and even in the Air Force F-16 or F-15E. And this is what gave the Tomcat such advantage. So it was basically a 10 by 10 inch square high resolution screen that was, you know, in between your legs. And then you had this giant stick in your left hand, which you controlled LANTIRN, everything from slewing it to bringing up all the coordinates and everything. What's interesting about LANTIRN and the Tomcat, and of course, VF-14 and VF-41 in 1999 were flying F-14As. Now, we had some new equipment in our F-14As, but these were the oldest F-14As in the inventory. And yet we had all these super cool new toys put into them. But for some of the older dogs like myself, learning how to operate all this new equipment in there, I mean, it was a whole new game. And it took a little while to get used to. And of course, doing this in combat just even raised the stakes even higher.
So I know my core fan base loves bureau numbers. So when you say the oldest, are we talking 160XXX bureau numbers or what?
Yeah, no, 160XXS, and even I think we had some 159s.
That's so, going way back.
We were pretty old, and I can tell you some of the equipment that we were dealing with in those airplanes. I can't just say enough about our squadron maintainers. We flew over 420 combat missions in a row without missing a sortie to open up Operation Allied Force and VF-14. It's what got us the Battle E and the Clifton Trophy and all those awards that make you the best fighter squadron in the Navy. But that's a credit to our maintenance department.
Absolutely amazing. So when you leave Norfolk, or maybe shortly before, you think it's going to be maybe a standard med cruise with some con ops against our NATO partners, like display of determination kind of stuff, and some port calls punctuating there. And suddenly the tenor completely changes with the fact that the Air Force has started doing strikes in Kosovo, and they need you to sortie at best speed and get there. So how did this change the dynamic in the ready room? What did you do in terms of starting to prep for the idea that you're actually going to go into harm's way, including CSAR preps? And what happened when you in-chopped, not just Sixth Fleet, but when you got into the Adriatic in terms of how airplanes are being written, how you assigned strikes? Help us out with some of all those details.
Yeah, a lot of moving parts. And it was about 2 days halfway across the Atlantic was when we realized, okay, we are definitely going to a mission change. We're going to be into combat. We don't know how long. It could be a couple days, could be a month. We had no idea. We knew that we were supposed to eventually go into the Arabian Gulf to do support missions in Iraq, but that was going to be put on the back burner. We were going to be the only aircraft carrier involved. That became obvious. And we went right into combat planning without having been given a target yet. A lot of in ready room discussion about how to operate LANTIRN in more detail with different loads. And our leadership, our Air Wing commander, Sparky Lyle, called all the commanding officers together. Jack Godlewski was the deputy commander who went on to be a flag officer. And we started getting our mindset right. And I'll still remember it like it was yesterday, the realization, okay, we're going to go into combat. We're going to be against an opposed enemy. The situation on the ground was complicated. We weren't sure how they were going to bifurcate where the Air Force was operating and where we were going to operate. That hadn't been determined yet. But then that night, I went into the ready room. All the officers in the ready room, all of our flyers, 16 pilots, 16 radar intercept officers. And I had that type of talk that a commanding officer has to have with their crews when they realize we're definitely going to combat. And that's when we set our strategy. First, this is what's going to happen. We started to talk about things like fog of war, the unknowns, how we were going to get better every day at our combat missions. And I gave every one of my aviators an opportunity to say whether or not they wanted to opt out. I was not the type of leader that said, you're all going to operate and you're going to operate on exactly my time frame. And I made a decision early on, knowing that half of my entire squadron had not even been on a deployment before, let alone combat. So very inexperienced, although very talented. I made a decision that I would not play an A team, B team, C team, meaning that the most high profile missions would be flown by only the senior aviators and the lesser missions by the less experienced. I made the crew lineup so that they would be permanent. I rarely would change out any of the pilot Rio teaming combinations, with some exceptions. So as a commanding officer, I would often fly with the youngest pilots, especially in their early missions, just to kind of give them a sense of some experience. So we had that heart-to-heart talk early on, and I think the ready room got into that mindset. Okay, this is serious. We're going to be shot at, and we made it a goal that nobody was going into this thing for combat medals. We're going to go there, do our job, deliver our ordnance, hit our targets, minimize civilian casualties, and get our airplanes back on deck. And that was our mindset from the get-go.
It reminds me of when we did the Bosnian conflict on USS America, the Final Cruise of America in '95. Suddenly the CSAR brief has a lot more meaning.
Yes.
You're paying attention to the details, you know, blood chits and process of radio comms and all that sort of stuff. Scott O'Grady had been shot down,
Yep.
you know, a year before. And so suddenly it's real. And what was kind of a thing in the abstract that you might listen to in passing is now something you're like, okay, what was that second thing again? Will you say that again?
Carrying weapons with you, blood chits. We had no eyes on the ground, so there were no special forces. This was completely being operated from the air, which is also very unique. So there were a couple pieces here that really had to change your mindset about all those pieces.
Plus, the Serbians were not exactly a friendly bunch by this point.
No.
So if you're going to fall into their hands, you know, it was going to be kind of sporty times. And obviously that hits aviators when you know there's going to be SAM shot at you, et cetera. I'm reminded when you talk about the attitude that the ready room had as you're briefing, you're doing the CO brief, the brief, as we say, of my late, great father-in-law, Hoot Foote, who was an A6 pilot, career A6 pilot. And he did 3 Route Pack 6 cruises back to back to back in Vietnam. And he would tell stories about pilots just putting their wings, you know, on the AC-doocy table coming back from a hop, or going in just saying, I'm not going. I don't care what the career implications are. You know, he had a lot of those sorts of stories of that time and that era. So it's heartening to hear that you didn't, you know, have any of those sorts of attitudes. Maybe it's a function of folks' inexperience, you know, and it's like we finally get to get green ink kind of a thing. But did you see anything on the margins as you went along that that was concerning to you as the CO?
I did. Nobody gave me their wings going into it, but about halfway through, I had one aviator that clearly just didn't want to be in it, and we had to sideline that person. We didn't ruin that person's career completely, but yes, we had to pay attention to that. We paid attention to, you know, the battle rhythm, if you will, for what the ready room would go through. And I laid that out very clearly, that this is about flying combat. We did our own planning, which for your listeners may not know that naval aviators do their own weaponeering. So that was a big part of every mission. The debriefing was also a big part. And then, you know, taking care of yourself, eating correctly, sleeping, a little bit less working out. I actually talked about that because we burned so many calories. First, we were operating from the Ionian Sea, so we were going to be flying missions that required us to be in the cockpit usually 3 to 4 hours for a single mission, just because they didn't want to put the carrier that close. And we wanted to have the learning curve so that everybody's individual experience on their first couple missions could be shared by everybody. So we did an all officers meeting every night at the end of flight ops, and we put in our video recordings of our missions, not to show what we were doing right. We were showing the minor mistakes that we were making so others wouldn't make the same mistakes. And that was a different mindset. I got many of the other squadrons doing the same thing once we started down that path.
So LANTIRN is user-friendly, but there were some gotchas. We can talk about some of that. But let's talk about, let's just call it the kill chain. From tasking that would come from the ATO through, you've hinted at mission planning, but I don't think the viewers understand the tooth to tail with respect to how much planning goes into how much fighting goes into how much debriefing, et cetera, et cetera. So how would a day in the life, once you're actually in this combat battle rhythm, happen?
So the Air Wing commander called all the commanding officers together. This was preparing for night 1, and we had a list of strategic targets that we were going to hit over the next 2 days that involved 4, maybe 5 strikes. I can't remember. It might have been more than 2 cycles in a day. And the Air Wing commander, Sparky Lyle, hand out combat leads to each mission. So believe it or not, on the first night strike, I was not the designated lead. Commander Joey Alcoin, who was skipper of VF-41, was the designated strike lead. And we'll talk more about that when we go into that mission. I had the second mission of the second night. So I already knew that, and we started planning in detail from that onset. Many of these missions would require 10 or 12 hours of dedicated mission planning that involved everything from not only our weaponeering, our loadouts, making sure the air wing and the ship knew our loadouts. We did not have an infinite number of bombs on board, so you can imagine building that into the cycle and how often we went alongside a combat oiler to get more bomb bodies and bomb kits, getting the airplane's position on the flight deck, and then going into the details of mission prep. And this is everything that you learn about how to plan for bombing missions, from looking at satellite imagery to looking at routes, understanding the threats. I mean, it was a remarkable amount of work for every mission, and then the actual doing the mission, and then coming back and debriefing it. And I will tell you, and I think most aviators would say the same thing, it would take me about 4 to 5 hours to settle down after any mission in which had been shot at. So you had to kind of build that, and you didn't go to sleep when you came back from a combat mission. I didn't, certainly, and I don't think most of our other aviators did either. So you're right, there's a huge time involved. Then once you get into it, it operates on kind of about a 48-hour cycle with all those things built in.
So as a strike lead, you're responsible for the entire strike package. So you've got to come up with the briefing cards. You've got to figure out altitude clearances, tanking plan. You've got to weaponeer not just your airplane, but basically, every airplane in the package. So by the time you get to the mass gaggle brief, you're handing out kneeboard cards to everybody that basically you've done all of the grunt work on. It's not like this stuff magically happens. As a strike lead, you have reps from every type, model, series, but you've got to see to the amount of planning, and that's a lot. And then also you've hinted at the weaponeering, and we'll keep it on class. But what was new to Tomcat guys was using what we call JMIMs, and how to do fusing and everything else. So just so the audience knows that, it's a very specific target. Let's just say nominally it's a command center, right, that wants you to hit one quadrant, and you got to figure out, okay, is this cinder block, or is it brick, or is it a mud hut, or whatever. And so how you do the fusing and the way you choose the weapons, it's not arbitrary, and it's not one size fits all. No. The other thing you got to figure out is where you're going to aim. And now with precision guided bombs, we have the ability, this is called DIMPY. And so all this stuff is kind of new to us as Tomcat guys, but we got good at it fast, right?
We did. And the F-14A with this variant of the LANTIRN, and remember there were others, and for the Tomcat it was actually called the LANTIRN targeting system. So it was almost system inside this cool pod called LANTIRN, which had its own set of navigational capability that had to just basically get in the right quadrant is where an F-14 knew it to be, but it had a whole different level of accuracy with its own navigation system. But in the version that we had, you couldn't activate the laser unless you were below 25,000 feet. Later version was up to 40,000 feet. That became really important in Kosovo because for us to turn the laser on, and we had to be able to see the ground. So we're not talking JDAMs, we're talking about laser-guided bombs like GBU-16, the 1,000-pound variant, the GBU-12 for the 500-pound variant, GBU-10s for the 2,000-pound variant. You actually had to see the ground and put the laser spot on the ground for us to make it work. So we were subject to weather, we were subject to altitude, and all that stuff, had to be put into the calculus.
And another part of the planning, and this is where we very much lean on the intel side of the house, is where are the SAM sites? Because ingress, egress, you want to avoid SAM rings, especially things with SA-6s and other mobile SAMs, that can get to be, kind of, let's just say, interesting. So you said Joe Alcoin leads night one. Did you get any pass down from him that you fused into your first mission?
So let's talk a little bit about the first night into Kosovo. You can imagine the energy on the flight deck. It was at 2 o'clock in the morning, time on target. I was actually in the flight. I was the backup strike lead. And, as much planning as we were all going through, I had obviously done my own planning for this first night mission because I was going to fly in it with Scooter, and I was involved with Joey and his team in the early planning. But we did some things that were completely unique, things that we did only one time, and probably as we reflect back on it now, things that we shouldn't have done. So we were very worried about not announcing our arrival. So this was a mission that had 40 airplanes, 8 strike fighters, so 4 Hornets, 4 Tomcats, to go after a POL, or a fuel tank facility. Think 4 large house-sized tanks. That was all the jet fuel for the Serbian airplanes flying out of Pristina Air Base in Kosovo. Joey does the brief, excellent brief, except they made the decision that we're going to do this lights out, no communications. So you and I know, we've flown enough to know that when you're flying in the middle of the night, even though you got night vision goggles, which is kind of like looking through binoculars and using the ambient light of the stars and the moon. And at that particular time in 1999, there wasn't a lot of moon, so we were going off of starlight. That was the only time we ever did that. We were more danger to ourselves joining up on big Air Force tankers to refuel on our way to the target than the enemy, because we didn't even use strip lights, nothing.
So how much goggle time did you guys have at that point?
Yeah, we'd had a fair bit. So I was most of us were pretty comfortable in the goggles. We had Anvis 9s. They were the newer variant of the night vision goggles. But for anybody that's used them, it's kind of like looking through 2 soda straws, you know, in a binocular fashion. So you lose a lot of situational awareness. But here's the kicker to night 1. We're on the flight deck. Pretty much we're going to launch every airplane on the flight deck, 40 plus airplanes plus spares. The Admiral, Winston Copeland, who was a Vietnam war hero himself, had shot down a MiG in Vietnam, landed single engine F-4. He's our strike group commander, very involved in approving our planning. Scooter and I are the very first airplane to launch. Now, you've seen the picture of the VF-14 80th anniversary bird. Some affectionately call it the flying Easter egg, white tail, white ventrals. We could not paint the tail out on the way into combat because we didn't have time. We didn't have time to cross. So I voluntarily said, I will fly in that jet because, it might be more visible even at altitude than the gray tactical paint jobs. We were the first airplane launched off for the strike, Scooter and I. And Joey, as the strike lead, never got off the deck. He had an IFF problem, interrogation friend or foe, mode 4 capability, had to have that working. So, and he asked for special permission to be in the strike package, got denied. So we break silence right away before we even get started, and Joey passes the lead to me and Scooter. So we had been really focused on our next mission, planning, and now we were, next man up, and we are now leading this strike. The spare launches, we get all the airplanes in the air, and now we're off to the tanker. What's really interesting about night 1, and again, you won't find this in too many history books, but it was a historic night, because even though this was our first combat mission for us off the USS Theodore Roosevelt, some 24 hours prior to us, airplanes were taking off out of Whiteman Air Force Base. B-2 Liberty stealth bombers were taking off and were going to be in their first operational mission in their history, and they were going to strike targets 10 minutes after we hit our target. So this was an incredibly coordinated global strike, and the planned lead is not in the air, and Scooter and I are now thrown into this no lights, no communication. We get everybody to the tanker except one airplane. One airplane got lost, and it was a VF-41 airplane. Alvin Young and Luce Cannon, his backseater. Alvin had been a super junior officer in my squadron and transitioned to a department head in our sister squadron, and his navigation system went off. So he was some 25, 30 miles away from the rendezvous point, and now we're going in with 7 strike fighters if we don't get them. He actually broke radio silence and said, hey, I'm on night vision goggles. If you could just light your burner, I'll be able to find you and rendezvous. So we did a change in our strike time to get Alvin joined up. This is important in the story. He finds us, he joins up, and after we get everybody tanked and we stop scaring each other from not running into each other with no lights, we are now off into moving into enemy territory, crossing the mountains of Skopje to go into Kosovo.
So how far of a transit was that?
So, we're 350-mile transit from ship to to actual target, but the tanking happened about halfway there. But once we entered into the southern border of Kosovo, we're talking about, a whole area that's about the size of the state of Rhode Island, so not big. And of course, we're going to be moving at 600 knots. Everybody that's involved in the strike package are fast movers. So, once you're into this timeline, you're talking minutes to get to the target area. Now, we had done all this planning, and it's one thing to, like we were talking about, train like you fight. We had been to Strike U, done these large packages, but there's no simulation for harm missiles coming off of, EA-6B Prowlers and F-18s to go after where you think the surface-to-air missile sites are going to be, so that you either, keep them from shooting at you or you take some of them out. And as much as I thought I knew what that was going to look like, seeing those things fly over my cockpit was an immediate eye-opener. So that was one of my first memories. And now, we're going into basically combat run. We're down at like 23,000 feet for us. The F-18s are up higher. And my navigation system immediately just went bad. And thankfully, I had done enough study of the area. I knew where the Kosovo Monument was, and I knew that road led to the target that we were going to get to. I was able to find it on the Lantern in manual and run my Lantern system up that road to the target area, because we were the lead. Everybody was following us. So if we don't get to the target area, nobody gets there. So as we approach Pristina Air Base, about, I'd say 6 or 7 miles, all of a sudden, our lights out concept clearly was wrong. They knew we were coming, because bullets are flying by us. Missiles are being shot in the air optically, because we're getting no indication that they're locking onto any of our airplanes. So the entire strike package is now defending themselves against, weapons that are coming up into the air. Interestingly, Pat Hall, Monty Hall, who was the skipper of VFA 87, his weapon hit the ground first on target to a pumping station. And then only 2 of the rest of the airplanes in the strike package actually released weapons and put them into the POL facility. Amazingly, it was Alvin and Loose Cannon, along with me and Scooter, that got our weapons off. But here was the really tough part. So Chili Culpepper, a young lieutenant, was our wingman. He was still with us. We were doing kind of the weave and maneuvering. I will tell you, I was completely heads down. I was not much help outside the cockpit, because I was dealing with the Lantern issues, and I had to make sure that I got the targeting information right. There was so much stuff happening going by our cockpit. I was actually not able to focus on my set. I actually took my night vision goggles off. And that might shock some people, like, shouldn't that be like your best defense? I said, no, I've got to find the target. And if I don't do that, then this mission's going to fail, and we're going to have to come back and do it again. So as we were about 5 miles from the target, this is when somebody clearly locked up our airplane with a surface-to-air missile, and 2 SA-6s were launched at us shortly after we released our weapons. So, remember, these are gravity-dropped weapons. They are imparted with kinetic energy that you're doing with your speed. So if you're flying at 600 miles an hour at 23,000 feet, that's the kinetic energy they have. So you're going to drop these weapons from 4 to 5 miles away, and they're going to glide to the ground based on a predicted spot. And then your laser will be coded to your specific weapons. In our case, 2,000-pound laser-guided weapons. And actually, in this case, we'd only put the laser on for the last 10 or 11 seconds time of flight to give them the most kinetic energy to get to the target with some maneuvering of those weapons. But as we were about 20 seconds away from impact for our weapons, is when we saw these 2 SA-6s launch. And they were right off our left wing, and it was clear that they were locked on us. We had cockpit indications, and that constant bearing, decreasing range. You could see the geometry. Even I, looking out the window, out the glass cockpit, could see the missiles. Scooter, smooth and as cool as a cucumber, as we are now on what we call truly government time, keeping steady so that our Lantern pod can see the ground. And I had to do this mental math. There's no calculation for a weapon system that's going to reach 2.5 times the speed of sound by the time it intercepts you, that you have to guesstimate is probably about 5 miles, 6 miles away. And we did the mental math, and we figured we had about 7 seconds between when our weapons would hit and we would be intercepted by these weapons. And we made a very quick decision that we would hold course. Our weapons hit the target. Chile never dropped his weapons. He was defending. And as soon as our weapons hit the target, without me having to say a word to Scooter, he flipped the jet upside down, pulled 8 Gs and a split S maneuver, and we watched 2 SA-6s split our formation. They actually went between our airplane and Chile's and didn't hit anybody. Unfortunately, we're now down at like 12,000 feet in the heart of the envelope of now AAA, and we did a zoom climb to get back up to 30,000 feet. Thankfully, we weren't hit. We returned back to the carrier, landed without incident, and that was night 1 in the books.
So just to put a finer point on a few of the details there, you talk about blanking out so that everybody knows. The Lantern pod is on station 8B. Yep. So the gimbaling, there are some sort of quadrants where if the airplane maneuvers inappropriately, you will blank out the laser. And so the bomb will stop guiding.
Correct. Right.
And just so everybody else knows, when we say GBU, guided bomb unit, that's basically a dumb Mark 80 series bomb with a fin kit on the front and the back, right? That's as high tech as it gets there when we talk about the difference between a GBU and a standard Mark 80 series bomb.
You know, I'll tell one other interesting part to this night 1, and you hear combat aviators, special forces, and I would submit professional athletes talk about this thing called time expansion, where time seemingly slows down and everything appears in slow motion. That moment from those SA-6s launching to us deciding to stay the course and maneuver and get our bombs into target was a time expansion for me. I can remember every second and splits of seconds as that was happening at the time. Even my mental calculation that we would have 7 seconds to defend ourselves, I can't even explain how or why. Maybe it's a survival instinct. Maybe it's a combination of experience at the time. There was fear and trepidation during the man up for the mission, but in the actual flying and doing it, none. I've never been more clear about what to do and why, and I know Scooter felt the same way. And I experienced it a number of times, but not every combat mission, but that first night for sure.
So we have another saying, which is discretion is the better part of valor. You had another sortie where not dropping was the right answer. Tell us about that one.
So it was only a few days later, and the weather had become a little problematic on some of our missions. And higher authority, the 4-star decided to do, the targeting decided that we should do some daytime missions. Now, the Serbs had been operating tanks, and this is about ethnic cleansing of Albanians in the southern part of the province of Kosovo. And they were using these bridges to move these tanks into some of the villages. So our target was to go after a pretty significant bridge. It was called the Ibar Bridge in southern Kosovo. I was the strike lead. Again, similar size package, but now our target time is noon, not 2 o'clock in the morning, noon, daylight, bright sunshine. And it was on 11 April, 1999. Now, of course, we do our own weaponeering, but we also do our own, check on, what's happening in, the local villages, what day of the week is it? Is there other things that are happening in normal life in a province like Kosovo? Well, it became apparent to me in our mission planning that April 11th was Easter Orthodox Sunday, and we had already conditioned the civilian population to think we were coming out with our operations at night. Now, for the first time, we're going to fly in the daytime. So that mission was unique in that it's first time for us to see the mountains of Kosovo, snow-capped, it's just beautiful countryside. And now we're going to take out a major line of communication, a bridge with 8 airplanes carrying 2,000 pounds of ordnance under the Tomcat and under the Hornets to drop this bridge. There was weather, but it wasn't so bad that we couldn't get our weapon systems on the bridges. Everybody had it all suitcase. We're flying in. I had the biggest resolution in my cockpit with the F-14 Tomcat. And from 10 miles out, there didn't appear to be any movement on the bridge. And I remember, and I was with Scooter Moyer again, saying, there's no movement on the bridge. It looks clear, which couldn't have been a better answer. So we're going to drop a bridge with very little or nothing on it. At 7 miles away, about a mile prior to where we're now getting close to release, I could see that there was stuff on the bridge. And at first I thought, well, maybe there are tanks on the bridge, but no, it was a traffic jam on the bridge. Completely nonstop, cars not moving. With about 3 to 4 seconds left to weapons release, I broke radio silence and aborted the mission. Thankfully, none of the airplanes dropped a weapon. We flew over the bridge. We had obviously videotape of it. We couldn't really respond to higher authority as to why we didn't drop. I didn't want to have that discussion. I was met by the Admiral on the flight deck when we landed. Want to know, obviously, what happened, why we didn't drop. I showed him the video, and of course, he took it from there. It's been a mission of discussion in ethics journals. It was a legal target. You know, should we have actually dropped, knowing that we would have had civilian casualties? A decision I made as a strike lead. It was something I impressed on all of the aviators in my ready room to say, you actually own the weapon regardless of what the orders are. You have to be responsible for where that weapon goes. And, you know, I would just tell you that every day that I'm still alive, I still think about that mission. I've met people from that part of the region. I've never actually met anybody that was on that bridge that day. But I think about what might have happened had we not made that right decision.
Well, there's no playbook that we've trained specifically for this scenario, right? This is why we make the big bucks, as we say.
Right.
And I don't know if you ever met the midshipman when you were superintendent that was a refugee from Kosovo. He actually headed NAFAC one year. And one of his earliest memories is bombs going off. He's on his apartment balcony watching bombs hit. That's sort of an interesting circle that fast forward 20 years and he's a mid and you're the superintendent. That's kind of an amazing sort of chain of events.
It is. And just to put one more footnote to the story, you may recall, because this became a high profile event, an Air Force F-15E Strike Eagle on April 12th, the next day, firing a laser-guided AGM-65 Maverick into a train trestle for the same reason. But again, in that type of airplane, you're looking basically through a soda straw at that targeting. What he couldn't see, there was actually a train approaching his aim point. So as his weapon hit, a train was actually crossing and took out quite a few innocent civilian lives and changed a little bit of the face of the war because of that loss of civilian life. So we did not have to go through that, thankfully. I felt bad for that pilot. You know, really was through no fault of his own that he couldn't see that. We had the benefit of this huge big screen TV, and I'm thankful that we had that level of resolution so we could make the decision early enough to not hurt anybody.
So how long did the conflict last? Were you on station for the duration, and how many sorties did you wind up flying ultimately?
So CAG 8 and Theodore Roosevelt was there for 55 days of the conflict till its conclusion. Most everybody in my ready room flew at least once every 2 days. Most of us flew, a good portion of us flew every day, and some flew twice a day. I ended up over that 55 days of conflict flying somewhere in the order of about 70, 75 combat missions specific to Kosovo. One of the most interesting ones that I'll just tell you very briefly was at the end of April 29th. We had already done a fairly classified mission into Montenegro to take out a bunch of Serbian-held aircraft that were in tunnels. We used GBU-24 penetrator bombs to get in there and take out a bunch of those airplanes. But some of those airplanes survived, and they dispersed them at an airfield called Podgorica, and they were hidden in camouflage. So we got a mission to basically just go out and find airplanes and take them out under this camouflage or anywhere in the taxiways or on the runways. My youngest pilot in the squadron, his call sign was Keebler, last name McDowell, a Naval Academy graduate. He got to the squadron in the middle of combat. We trained him up, and his first combat mission was paired with me. Slammer Richardson was the lead, my XO, one of the best fighter pilots ever, leading a 4-plane division of Tophatters. We were Dash 4, and we had a cloud deck. We couldn't see the ground. And I took it amongst myself, and I told Slammer, we're going to dip below the cloud level. So we went down below 17,000 feet. Now we're highlighted, big, shadowy Tomcat below a cloud deck. And I spotted what I believed from about 10 miles out might be an airplane, because I just got a glint of some light off of a canopy. I put my spot on it, and sure enough, as we got close enough, I could see the wings. And a Super Galeb's about 32 foot wingspan, so you couldn't even really tell it was an airplane till it was almost time for weapons release. Meanwhile, we're being shot at. Keebler, first combat mission, not even aware that bullets are going by our canopy. I calmly said, you might want to start maneuvering the airplane just a little bit, kind of do a little weave here so we're not so predictable. Anyway, we put 2 500-pound laser-guided bombs through an armed Super Galeb at GA4. Spectacular video. I wish I could show it to you. Top Gun still shows that in their training program. It was actually the only videotaped kill of an airplane on the ground by the Navy in that conflict. 2 F-18s visually spotted our hit and took out 2 additional airplanes, but they didn't have very good video of it. So Keebler McDowell, first mission, gets an airplane kill on the ground, receives the Air Medal with Combat V. So that was a pretty interesting part of that story, one of many, many combat stories.
So you also received a lot of recognition and a lot of awards, DFC, Bronze Star, Air Medal, as a function of your efforts during the Kosovo campaign. Fantastic work there. Slammer Richardson, it's like degrees of separation from episodes on Mooch's channel.
Yes.
I'll remind everybody that he was the principal in the flat spin episode that we did at Hook. So if you haven't seen that one, check it out. Great American, fantastic individual, and also a great aviator and a Navy leader. Your XO, small world, great Tomcat community, fantastic stuff. So we're talking about sayings here. Another one that I like to tell mids with respect to the decision they make on induction day is you're part of an expeditionary force, not a garrison force. So this means you fight not only the war, you fight the war between the wars. And Kosovo is a good example of the war between the wars. So our professional career and us actually doing stuff in anger is not a function of a full-up hot war. That's kind of the beauty of being part of carrier aviation, and your efforts during the Kosovo campaign prove it in spades.
And to make that final point even more succinct, when we finished those 55 days of combat in Kosovo and Operation Allied Force, we got a port visit in Palma de Mallorca, and then we left and we went through the Suez Canal and into the Red Sea and then up into the Arabian Gulf and flew 33 days of steady combat in Iraq. So very unique deployment, 55 days of combat in Kosovo and then 33 days of combat in Iraq. So it makes your point. We were expeditionary. We were, an aircraft carrier is the only thing that can do that in that short time frame. And of course, we were already combat tested. We were exceptionally good at our weaponeering. And we did some really amazing work at the tail end of what was then known as still Operation Southern Watch. But this was really the precursor to what would be kind of Desert Storm 2.
It's interesting, and it seems a bit galling, if not ironic, that people were asking at the fall of the Soviet Union what were aircraft carriers for. And with these stories, you have your answer, and that remains true today. So, Admiral, joining us from your office there at the University of Nebraska, we'll remind everybody that Slapshot is the president of the University of Nebraska, wearing his Cornhusker tie for us today, along with his flight jacket. This is the second in our Slapshot series. Look for more in the future. As always, great to see you, sir, and thanks for your time today.
Mooch, always good to be with you, and thanks for letting me tell some of these stories that are so impactful and meaningful to naval aviation.
Thank you, sir. All right, that's going to do it for this episode. If you're a first-time viewer, please ring the bell and become a subscriber so you don't miss anything. Give me the likes and comment. Check the links below for merch, including where to get the Punks Trilogy, my first 3 novels about life in a Tomcat squadron, just re-released by the Naval Institute Press. When you check out, use the discount code PUNKYT for 25% off. If you'd like to help support the channel, please consider using the super thanks, the heart icon below, or become a patron at patreon.com/WardCarroll. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again soon.